So I was scrolling the ESPN YouTube channel a couple of days or maybe a week plus ago, and there was an interesting YouTube video that showed up under the ESPN channel. And the title was Stephen A. Smith says he's concerned about the future of sports media, which kind of intrigued me because on the one hand, you read the comments and they all say, well, Stephen A. Smith is responsible for the state of sports media. Stephen A. Smith is part of the problem with it. I was more upset with the fact that I watched the documentary that they're trying to promote. So Stephen A. Smith executive produced, or had his hand in, a documentary on ESPN Plus called Up for Debate, which talks about the history of sports media and sports talk debate shows, the rise of that. But my thing is, in the documentary, it doesn't ever feel like Stephen A. Smith is truly concerned the way that the title says. So I think that there's really a kind of miscommunication in terms of what Stephen A. Smith was trying to say here versus what he's trying to say in the documentary, because I don't think that he's addressing that in the documentary. If you're new here, welcome in, and if you know me, welcome back. Feel free to like, subscribe. Everything is important. I appreciate you guys. Thank you guys for indulging me into talking for a long period of time on this YouTube channel, and I appreciate it. So back to the video. So for those of you that are not new to the channel, you guys know that I have a fascination with sports media. I went to college for this. I went to college for broadcast journalism with a focus in sports at the University of Maryland as a part of the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism. And I went to college at a time where the landscape of sports journalism and sports broadcasting was changing. When I was in school, we were taught not to film vertically. We were taught to film horizontally, rule of thirds and all of that. And now, fast forward, everybody's filming vertically. You're for TikTok, Instagram Reels, Snapchat, YouTube Shorts. Anywhere you can get your message across, you can just use from the power of your phone. And that, while that was the case back then as well, filming horizontally was still the main thing because you were trying to film for something that would be put on TV or something like that. And so I, as a former employee of ESPN, as someone that is in the sports media realm and has been in the sports media realm for 7 years, I thought that I think that I am a good person to dissect this documentary for what it is. I'm trying to be as fair as possible on both sides. As someone that used to work there, I understand the fact that sports journalism, a lot of people have really polarizing opinions on it, and I'm going to try to be very level-headed about it. This is something that I'm very passionate about, so I'm going to try not to lose track and keep tangents and stuff. So the documentary is 3 parts, and each segment is about 30 minutes. Now, from the jump, I feel like the story of sports media, debate shows, and broadcast journalism is too vast to just try to put into a 90-minute project. Now, for the 90-minute project, they do talk about a lot of topics. I did write notes on my phone because I watched it like a week ago, and there are a lot of things that did sit with me. That's why I really haven't made any NBA Finals videos or whatnot, because it's just something that's been weighing on my sense of being. I don't know. So I want to talk about this sports media documentary because I haven't really seen any other YouTube coverage on it, except for Dan Le Batard, who says that a lot of his interview was cut out, and we will get to that. But yeah, I think the main thing here is that this sports media documentary, while it might have the best of intentions, while it might try its best to cover everything, we can't forget that this is under ESPN Plus and executive produced by Stephen A. Smith. This kind of gives vibes on when Michael Jordan had a hand in producing The Last Dance. You knew that you were going to get a lot of information, but you also knew that a lot of information, or not a lot of, well, information, certain things are not going to be in this documentary, or they're not going to be the forefront of the documentary when they should be, and certain people are not going to be in the documentary, etc., etc. So I'm going to talk about part 1. Now, I wrote bullet points on my phone, so I'm going to try to see if I can remember off the top. Part 1 talks about Stephen A. Smith's daily routine, how he says he wakes up, listens to the radio, whatnot, and that's how it really starts. And then episode 1 is really good. I will say episode 1 is the best episode out of the 3. 1, because it talks about the sports media history, the history of how we got two sports TV debate shows up until a time where, sports TV, like sports reporters weren't on TV. So it talks about a time where ESPN didn't exist. It talks about a time before ESPN, even with ABC Wide World of Sports with Howard Cosell. And for everyone that wants to get into the sports media industry, I think it is a really good way to learn the history, or a good jumping off point. This documentary should not be the be all end all for anything, but I do think that it is a good starting point for people that are like, I'm curious about the start of sports media, because this is the part where it feels like everything is being told, versus like part 2 and part 3 where it feels like ESPN's putting their spin on it to make themselves look as best as they could. I said it's a good history of how the writers became the TV people, and I put everyone is here, even Dan Le Batard. And what I mean by that isn't like I'm surprised that Le Batard. Actually, I am surprised that Le Batard is there, because there are only a few people that talk about sports debate negatively in this documentary. I think I can count them basically on one hand. I think it's Bill Plaschke, Bob Lee says something in passing, and then Dan Le Batard is the main person that's like outright like being like, dude, this sports debate stuff, it's really corrosive, it's really acidic, and it's really been a net negative. Dan Le Batard, I think, is one of the only people that like come out and say this, and I respect him for that heavily. But yeah, it talks about how a lot of the sports TV media people that you see today started in journalism, where it was Skip Bayless, Dallas Morning News, Stephen A. Smith, Philadelphia Inquirer, Bob Ryan was at the Boston Globe, Woody Page, like Michael Wilbon and Tony Kornheiser were at the Washington Post, and how like their show dynamic basically was just the same as them being in the workplace, like them arguing in the office. That's basically the PTI show dynamic. They talk about how important Wilbon and Kornheiser were to the entire sports debate ecosystem. They talk about the birth of PTI. I think it's credited as the first sports TV debate show. I think it's credited as the first, because the sports reporters doesn't count. They do talk about the sports reporters, which is also important, because that was also a great way for reporters around the country to promote what they wrote in newspapers. Dan Le Batard talked about that briefly, where sports reporters, for those of you that don't know, are too young. Sports reporters was a show where there would be about 3 or 4 reporters, and it was hosted by Dick Schaap, and they would just talk about different topics that happened throughout the country. And that was like the first iteration on TV of like takes being given. They weren't takes being given for the sake of them being hot or for the sake of them getting attention or whatnot. They also talk about the rise of sports radio, where it starts with like Mad Dog, Mike and the Mad Dog. They talk about that, which is also, so episode 1 is a great overall history. Like it's also like it's informative. It gives a good timeline of just ESPN getting started, what ESPN used to be, how they used to cover like adult softball games or something like that, or what they used to cover whatever they could. And then they started to get more and more licensing for like college basketball, college sports, and that's how it became what it is today. So this documentary is like kind of talking about like the rise of debate, but also talking about just sports media in general. And I think that that's an interesting choice, because I feel like this documentary should just be about sports media, and then you have a debate section. But I feel that since Stephen A. Smith's hands are behind it, it talks about the rise of sports debate television, which I feel like if you just said sports media, a lot more people would be more likely to give it a watch. All right, I wrote the divide between print and TV. Yep. Okay. Back then, TV wasn't seen as real journalism. Being in the newspapers was seen as real journalism, but then there were more and more opportunities in TV that reporters started to do both, and eventually abandon print altogether. So I wrote down also a lot of ESPN propaganda, but some of it is justified talks about the rise of ESPN. Yep, it reads as ESPN made a documentary about ESPN. They're not going to put the bad stuff in there. That's what, even in episode 1, you felt some like traces of it, but you were also like, they are still telling a really good history of ESPN. And I think that was at a time no one had a real problem with ESPN. We all loved Dan Patrick, Stuart Scott, other personalities. You know, you had those "This is Sports Center" commercials that everybody loved. It was a golden era for ESPN to have all of this stuff. ESPN 10, 15 years ago is seen in such a different light. At this point in episode 1, the ESPN propaganda, ESPN framing doesn't really bother me, because for the most part, ESPN was fine. It's good. Like, it was very likable. It wasn't as divisive as people make it out to be now. And that's where we get into episode 2, unless my notes say episode 1 still. Oh, there was an interesting quote in episode 1 where Bob Lee calls, like, the rise to debate and turns it from, like, an art form, or you can call it a virus. I think that's a really great quote, where Bob Lee was like, yeah, some people call it an art form, some people say it's a virus. And it would have been weird if Stephen A. Smith executive produced this documentary and tried to make it pass off that everything that's been said about sports debate is positive. That would have been wild. I wish there was more negative, but I know that the more people talk negatively about the sports debate stuff, it makes him look bad, and I know he's not in this to make himself look bad, so I totally understand it. So I think in his mind, he's trying his best to, like, tell all sides, but one side's getting told more than most. And then it talks about how Pardon the Interruption in 2001 was an absolute hit, and how much a rundown on the screen was a game changer, and it's a perfect TV show format. I've talked about this before. Having two people having a rundown of, like, what's coming up is really important, because it would tell you whether like how many segments are there, and it doesn't keep the audience guessing, which I think was, like, one of the best ideas. Also, the fact that they don't stay on certain topics for that long is very important. I think that that's very important. It's the perfect show format, and that's why it's one of the few untouched shows on ESPN. All right, now we get to episode 2. All right, Around the Horn 2002, and they kept in Le Batard's criticisms on how the debate form has turned out, and Le Batard thinks it has regressed, but Stephen A. obviously doesn't. I think it has regressed. I'm more towards Le Batard's side for sure. I think that ever since Max Kellerman has left, First Take doesn't, maybe it's because I grew up. Maybe it's because I was in college at the time. Maybe it was because I still had starry eyes towards the industry or whatever. But I feel like as soon as, like, Max Kellerman left First Take, it just feels different. It's like, yes, it's the #1 show. I actually liked when it was just two people. And Stephen A. and Skip together was fine, but, like, I liked when then Max was one of the few people that, like, challenged Stephen A. Smith. And here, now you see we're in an era where if you challenge Stephen A. Smith on First Take, for real, it becomes news, because we're all so surprised about it. And I don't think that's a good thing for a debate show. It never really feels like, it always feels like people are pulling their punches on that show. And when someone actually, like, lets one slip, it becomes, like, national. And I also think that the way that Le Batard says that it's regressed and Stephen A. doesn't shows a kind of disconnect here on how Stephen A. views the sports media industry, because from his perspective, he has nothing but, like, benefited from it and turned it into what it is today. Whereas you can't really say the same for many other people besides, like, Skip Bayless, in terms of people that have, like, shaped the platform and media, because there have been so many. Le Batard's right. There have been so many other imitators of that kind of format. But the thing is, I wish more people copied PTI and Around the Horn than First Take. I really wish that there are more people that copied that show's format. I wish that more people copied PTI and Around the Horn, 1,000%. So then they talk about Cold Pizza and how Skip Bayless was there, and nobody really could handle Skip Bayless's antics until Stephen A. Smith. Now, I will say, before this became First Take, this was great television. It's hard to explain, because this was before they became characters of themselves. This one felt like the most genuine version of these two, where they were just two people at a water cooler arguing, or in a barbershop, versus what we see now, where it's like Stephen A. Smith doing WWE entrances at Cowboy fans and stuff like that. This is before they became, like, personas or characters of themselves, I would say. Now, they briefly talk about the part where Skip Bayless talks about Chris Bosh and calls him soft, and Chris Bosh comes on First Take, and Skip Bayless doesn't pull any punches, right? Really, like, he doesn't waver, right? A lot of people in our industry, I feel like, would, if you were saying that kind of that cash, if you're talking that cash for a little bit, and they go to interview with Jamel Hill. They hand Jamel Hill the iPad, and Jamel Hill is like, "Yep, I'm on that set, man. That was mad uncomfortable, bro. I'm gonna tell you right now." Here's where I started to get the idea that some stuff in the documentary was missing, right? So they talk about Jim Rome. They talk about how Jim Rome, and they called Jim Everett. He kept calling Jim Everett Chris Everett, right? And then Jim Everett goes on to whatever talk show. I think this is like early 2000s, and Jim Rome keeps calling Jim Everett Chris, and then Jim Everett flips a table and tries to just like push Jim Rome down. Now that got like the most attention, and I think that was kind of the start, I want to say, of ESPN covering ESPN. Because there's a cycle that's happened nowadays where, like, the sporting debate cycle, this doesn't really get talked, I think it gets talked about a little bit. ESPN is not afraid to cover and cycle what another ESPN personality said on another show, where they'll be like, "Oh, Austin Rivers said this," and then you see that on NBA Today, and you're like, "Well, he said that on Get Up." Now they're covering that on NBA Today. So it kind of feels like sometimes ESPN personalities cycle in, and it becomes more about what they said and stuff like that. So that also happens. But at no point did they mention the fact, they didn't mention Jim Rome is burning in this entire show. And that's where I started to be like, all right, that's a little bit, I feel like Jim Rome is burning was a really I didn't like the show. Don't get me wrong, I didn't like Jim Rome is burning. It made it feel like it was like something I was like, that I feel like that should be in the documentary at least, because you're talking about Jim Rome here, but you're not talking about the fact that he got Jim Rome is burning for like a long time. I don't know how long that show was on TV, but there are shows that get seen but aren't really talked about that I wish got talked about and expanded on more. Whether it was Sports Nation with like Sports Nation gets shown a little bit, but Sports Nation gets seen as like a debate offshoot, because then Stephen A. Smith was like, yeah, because of First Take, a lot of other debate shows came out, and he might be right. He's right. But some of these I don't really see as debate shows, right? Like, for example, I don't really see Sports Nation like, I felt Sports Nation kind of had its own fun element, right? And it involved the audience, and it was unique. This is not in the documentary. DLHQ, I think that's one of the most unique shows, but I don't consider it, I wouldn't consider it a First Take clone. I would consider it a PTI clone. Because you had the rundown on the side. You only had like a couple of like minutes. You covered a lot in a little bit of time. I also think DLHQ is so influential because of all people, Dan Le Batard brought his dad on as his co-host. I think that's very significant in terms of the fact where it's like, you don't have to be an experienced journalist or sports person to be on these shows and be entertaining. I think that's very important. That's not on the whatever. Also, I'm noticing that a lot of Fox Sports employees are not in this documentary. Wasn't really expecting them to be. Skip Bayless is not in this documentary. He's not talking in this documentary. Nick Wright is not talking in this documentary. A lot of I don't think there's a single Fox Sports employee. No Joy Taylor, no Chris Broussard, no whatever. But you know who is in this documentary? Fucking Clay Travis. Yeah, because there's a tangent where they talk about how sports media influenced political media in terms of like that kind of debate format. And while it's true, did not need that in the documentary, man. Like, it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I get it, but why is Clay Travis on my screen? If that makes sense. Oh, Stephen A. Smith also talks about how the First Take also inspired debate-inspired podcasts, but I feel like that, I can't give him that, right? Radio existed for a long time. Like, sports radio has existed for a long time, so it's like one of those things where it's like, I don't think that's actually the case. So like in his mind, he does think First Take did birth a lot of things, but I don't think that they are completely and 100% responsible. You know what I'm saying? Also, they have Dan Le Batard painted as the villain because once again, I think he's the only one in the documentary that really is like just firmly on the just I hate everything about this. And I think that he shares a sentiment a lot of people are upset with how ESPN has turned into their coverage, because now it feels like more like ESPN covering ESPN a lot of the time, where like the NBA Finals, there was a tweet that had Stephen A. Smith tunnel walk-ups. Again, who the fuck wants that? I'm asking generally. Who wants that? It gets ratioed every time, and it's like, and it goes to the, I feel like this goes to the ESPN mindset now, where it feels like all press is good press. I don't think that that is a good thing, especially because it's so different than what it used to be. A lot of people now see ESPN in the same category as like a Bleacher Report in terms of the attention grabbing, do whatever. It didn't always used to be like that. I remember a time where ESPN wasn't on YouTube, and all of these videos were natively on ESPN.com. Do I think it was a bad move? No. Do I think that they changed that too late? Yes. They should have done that years earlier. Again, that's a part of the documentary that that's not going to be talked about, because that's like the niche nerd thing that only I really care about or noticed while I was working there. Oh, also in the documentary is Troy Aikman and Matt Barnes, Cameron, and a lot, because they're trying to get a lot of outside non-journalist perspective now because of what the realm has turned into. Troy Aikman and Matt Barnes gave their opinions on what it felt like to be an athlete covered by these shows. And I think Matt Barnes was like, yeah, man, this wasn't fun. Because again, the documentary, the way that we cover athletes now is so bizarre compared to like 3 decades ago, honestly, where every single thing is scrutinized, whether it's on social media, and a social media post can then turn into a First Take A block. Everything is so just under a microscope all the time. And this documentary doesn't really, they talk about it, but they also don't really, they try to skirt around the fact that a lot of people were like, hey, the athletes were like, hey, it's not the best feeling, but like the documentary, it feels like the documentary just like laughs nervously and goes, what's next? Because like it doesn't feel like we like zone in on that, be like, hey, because if they did, again, ESPN's behind this, Stephen A. Smith's behind it. If they did, it would be admitting that like what they're doing in sports debate has a negative connotation, negative output, which they're not going to admit in the documentary. And then the last part of episode 2 was that they were talking about how sports debate has brought in many diverse voices to TV and been able to build an avenue or a road for not only different diverse voices, but different former athlete analyst voices as well, which is great. I understand that. That's fine. Now, I want to get into the part where I found the most fascinating, the future. Now, for episode 3, I wrote that Stephen A. Smith seems to always like where the business is going and sees new formats as people walking into his lane. So Stephen A. Smith goes, I think he's like, I welcome any and all new voices and whatever. Keep in mind, you're coming into my world, buddy. And I'm like, okay. Meanwhile, Michael Wilbon doesn't like where it's going. And I want to tell you, when I worked at ESPN, I once tried to teach Michael Wilbon how to play Pokemon Go in an elevator, which did not go well because I had to explain to him what Pokemon was. This is like when Pokemon Go was big. One of my favorite ESPN stories, by the way. I think episode 3 in the future is handled okay. I feel like there is a lot more to cover, and I feel like just like episode 2, episode 3 barely scratches the surface of what can be the future of sports media. They talk about Shannon Sharp, they talk about Cameron, they still talk about a lot of traditional formats and not the more experimental style formats, because again, I wouldn't be surprised, these are formats that ESPN does not dip their hands into. ESPN doesn't have a Twitch. They do have a TikTok. They did have a Snapchat. They had a SportsCenter Snapchat. I don't know if they still have that. But that should have been, I feel like that could have been mentioned in the documentary a lot more. The episode also really confirms to me that having your own platform is the best thing that you can do. And it talks about how Stephen A. Smith has his own podcast outside of the ESPN umbrella. Shannon Sharp made his own thing. Cameron made his own thing. And it talks about how having the audience and having the attention and because everyone's apparently just grabbing for attention, and having that audience and those eyeballs is what rules. And I wholeheartedly agree. I think social media has been the ultimate game changer, the ultimate leveler in terms of bringing in new voices. Whenever someone asks me what they should do to get into the industry, I'm like, hey bro, start everything right now. Just start everything right now. Go ahead, you can do it. There are a lot of free resources out there, and I think that they get that part right in terms of the platform, whatever. I do think that, again, this is ESPN and Stephen A. Smith. ESPN does a great way of promoting the future of sports media while also doing their best to remind you of how involved ESPN will be and is in that. They don't mention competitors. They don't mention a lot of content creators. They do mention, I wish that King of the Fourth Quarter, I wish that Kenny was in this documentary. Kenny is featured in this documentary. It's like his 2K, they put his 2K videos in there, and I think they put his Numbers on the Board podcast up there. I wish that Kenny was able to sit down and talk on this documentary, because I feel like his insight would have been the most valuable of all in this episode. Now, this episode, no one really felt like a how do you do fellow kids, like so out of touch. But I also just sat there and was like, ESPN has a lot of younger talent. I wish they were brought in for this, but it wasn't. So that's why episode 3, the future part, feels a little bit, it leaves a lot to be desired. I'm going to be honest. And of course, they talk about King of the Fourth Quarter, and then King of the Fourth Quarter went on Stephen A. Smith's show months ago and now has his own show on ESPN2, which I think is a great thing. I think it's a great thing to show that you can go from content creator to traditional. It always felt, years ago, it always felt that you couldn't go that route. It never felt like, it always felt like content creation was over here, traditional sports media is over here. If you're not an athlete, if you weren't already in that circle of people, then you're not going to be able to make that leap. I think that Kenny is doing amazing things for the future of sports media, and he's just the beginning, right? He's doing amazing things and trailblazing. Everywhere he goes, he's being a trailblazer. So I'm happy with that part. I wish that he was able to sit down and be in this documentary. If they reached out to him or whatnot, that I don't know, but I just wish that was the case. I wish that we heard more younger voices. I really wish that we heard more younger voices in this part of the documentary. And that raised another question for me, is that does ESPN know who the younger voices are? Are they aware of that? What is ESPN's real radar for that? I have no idea. You know what I'm saying? I do not know. I wish that they talked about ESPN's transition to YouTube. I wish that they talked about the fact that a lot of ESPN talent have their own YouTube channels now, whether it's under the ESPN umbrella or not. Like Mina Kimes has her own YouTube channel. Malika Andrews has her own YouTube channel. Certain talent do have their own separate YouTube channels from the mass ESPN one. I wish that they expanded on that. And then at the end, they have Stephen A. Smith talking to some college kids, whatnot, and the documentary ends. So I think it's a good like shallow end in terms of sports media. But at the same time, if I was someone brand new to sports media and you asked me about it, I'd be like, okay, you can watch this. However, we got to watch other stuff here, because that can't be your only form of information on this topic. Yeah, those are my thoughts on this. I feel like for those of you that watch the documentary, feel free to tell me your thoughts. I appreciate all of them. And before my camera overheats, I'm going to say goodbye. I love you guys, and I'll see you guys later. Have a good one.